The voice on the radio was no longer asking for clarification. It was ordering a 275-meter Iranian-flagged cargo ship to vacate its engine room because disabling fire was seconds away. For 6 hours, the warnings had gone out across the water. For 6 hours, the ship kept moving. Then the USS Spruance fired into the engine room, blew out propulsion, and Marines from the 31st of March Expeditionary Unit boarded the vessel in the dark and took control. That image is the headline. It is not the real story. The real story is that Iran crossed the line first. It turned Hormuz from a coercive bargaining chip into a zone of indiscriminate risk. And once it did that, Washington gained the argument it needed to transform a blockade on paper into a seizure regime in practice. That is the shift that matters. Because as long as Iran was merely threatening the Strait of Hormuz, the world could still tell itself this was brinkmanship. Another round of escalation theater in a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world, S-oil markets, would panic, tankers would hesitate, insurance costs would jump, and Tehran could still claim it was using pressure to force political concessions. But on the 18th of April, the story changed. Commercial traffic began breaking apart in panic. Around 20 ships reportedly altered course toward Oman. At least 3 merchant vessels were targeted in the strait. One of them was the Indian Suezmax tanker Samar Herald, carrying 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil. The captain had already been told his name was on the approved transit list. He was not sneaking through. He had permission. Then gunfire came anyway. No serious warning, no coherent challenge, no consistent rules, just the sound of a waterway slipping from controlled intimidation into arbitrary violence. That moment mattered more than any speech, because once a regime starts shooting at ships it has already cleared, it is no longer signaling strength. It is advertising that the ladder of escalation is no longer under its own control. And once that happens, every outside actor starts recalculating at once. Shipping companies recalculate, oil markets recalculate, India recalculates, and the United States recalculates. That is why the seizure of MV Tuska on the 19th of April was not just a tactical action. It was the first visible proof that Washington had decided Iran. S behavior had created the opening for a much larger enforcement architecture. Tuska was not a symbolic fishing boat. It was a massive Iranian-flagged cargo vessel on the U.S. sanctions list, trying to make for Bandar Abbas through a blockade that had already been challenged in the ugliest possible way. The destroyer tracking it did not merely shadow it. It issued repeated orders. When those orders were ignored, the Americans went from warning to disabling fire, then they went from disabling fire to boarding, then they went from boarding to seizure. And that sequence matters because it established a template. First, identify second, isolate third, disable fourth, board fifth, inspect, and hold. That is no longer a temporary warning posture. That is a scalable model. The source document is very clear about what followed. The Pentagon did not present Tuska as a one-off. The move was immediately framed as the opening shot in a broader campaign to track and potentially seize Iran-linked vessels in international waters. That means the real escalation is not the shell that hit one engine room. The real escalation is institutional. Washington is trying to convert the Strait of Hormuz from a contested passage into a layered kill and control zone where every Iran-linked ship can be found, classified, followed, and intercepted. Look at the system described around that goal. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers forward in the strait, the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli carrying the 31st of March Expeditionary Unit for opposed boarding, SEAL teams available for hire, risk seizures. Seahawk helicopters for fast rope insertions, the USS Lewis B. Puller as an expeditionary sea base with special operations support, and Apache helicopters, carrier strike groups built around the USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Abraham Lincoln, FAA-18S and F-35Cs maintaining air cover, PA Poseidon's hunting and mapping the maritime picture, Triton drones staying up for hours, tankers in the air, keeping the entire machine fueled. Task Force 59 using AI-enabled unmanned systems to build a digital fingerprint on every hull, every heat signature, every propeller sound moving through the strait. The point of listing all that is not spectacle. The point is that Washington is no longer relying on visibility alone. It is building density of sensors, density of reaction options, density of force packages, density of persistence. In plain English, it is trying to make invisibility impossible. That is a direct strike at the logic Iran has relied on for years. Tehran's maritime strategy was built on ambiguity, deniability, and clutter. Mine the water just enough to create fear, use fast boats just enough to overload reaction time. Hide missile batteries long enough to keep everyone guessing, turn the strait into a place where no one is ever fully certain who will be hit, when, or why. That kind of strategy works when the other side is hesitant, thinly deployed, politically divided, or blind in too many places at once. It works much less well when the other side decides to flood the zone with destroyers, carrier aviation, patrol aircraft, helicopters, unmanned surface systems, underwater scanners, and boarding teams that are prepared not just to observe violations, but to physically remove ships from the equation. That is why this story has to be understood on two levels at the same time. On the surface, America is trying to reopen Hormuz and squeeze Iranian exports. At the deeper level, America is trying to deny Iran the one environment where Iran's asymmetric model has historically been strongest, the narrow, crowded, legally murky, sensor-confused battle space where a weaker power can make a stronger power pay for every mile of passage. Washington is trying to drain that environment of uncertainty, and that is exactly why this next phase is so dangerous, because the source document is equally clear that the American buildup solves one problem by stepping deeper into several others. Hormuz is narrow, 33 kilometers at its tightest point is not a forgiving geometry. Iran has spent decades preparing for that geometry with mines, fast attack craft, midget submarines, coastal anti-ship missiles, and drones cheap enough to throw in waves. The numbers alone explain the danger: thousands of naval mines, more than 180 fast attack craft, over 20 Gadir-class submarines, coastal missile batteries designed to fire and disappear, Shahid-style drones that cost a fraction of the missiles used to intercept them. That is not a navy designed to win a conventional war. It is a system designed to create saturation, confusion, delay, and political shock. Iran's problem now is that this system appears much better suited to a single punishing ambush than to a prolonged contest of attrition. The source text says it well in substance, even if not in those exact words. Iran built an environment for one violent trap, while Washington is trying to remove the water from the trap entirely. That may be the most important insight in the whole piece. If America can keep scanning mine lanes, keep aircraft in the air, keep destroyers in firing position, keep special operations forces ready, and keep every suspicious vessel under persistent track, then Iran's advantage begins to shrink from "we can make this strait ungovernable" to "we can still make any day inside it expensive." That is a serious downgrade. But it is not a clean victory, because every additional American platform in the region is also another target set. Every boarding action carries its own risk of casualties, misidentification, or rapid retaliation. Every Iranian-linked vessel seized in the Gulf of Oman or Arabian Sea creates more pressure for Tehran to answer somewhere, somehow, even if not symmetrically. And every promise by Trump that America will destroy bridges and power plants if Tehran refuses terms raises the stakes further, because it narrows the political room for both sides at the exact moment they may still want an off-ramp that brings the story to Islamabad. At first glance, the source text seems to jump abruptly from Hormuz to Pakistan. It actually does not. Islamabad is where the maritime pressure is supposed to cash out politically. The logic is simple. First, demonstrate that firing on neutral shipping carries consequences. Second, show that sanctions are not just financial paperwork, but can become armed interdiction. Third, make Iran understand that if it keeps the strait closed, it will watch ship after ship get tracked, disabled, boarded, or turned back. Fourth, bring that pressure to the table and force a choice. Make concessions and reopen Hormuz for real. Or face a maritime strangulation campaign that gradually cuts exports, constrains proxy supply lines, and makes every outward voyage a gamble. That is what gives the C-17 arrivals near Islamabad their significance. They are not just transport flights in a vacuum. In the story, S-Logic, they are the shadow cast by the maritime campaign onto diplomacy. The negotiations are being staged under the weight of what just happened at sea, and that is why Iran's move looks so consequentially bad in this telling by firing on shipping after already closing Hormuz again. Tehran did not simply raise pressure on America. It handed Washington the one thing Washington needed most: a cleaner argument, an argument for escalation, an argument for interdiction, an argument that the strait is no longer merely a pressure valve, but an active zone of arbitrary threat. Once Iran crossed that line, the first boarding no longer looked like overreach. It looked like precedent. That does not mean the American strategy is guaranteed to work. It may overstretch. It may provoke exactly the broader escalation it claims to be preventing. It may discover that even perfect surveillance cannot fully sanitize a narrow waterway loaded with mines, missiles, drones, and political desperation. But the structure is now unmistakable. Iran thought it was showing the world that the blockade was fragile. Instead, it may have shown Washington that the moment had come to stop warning and start taking ships. And once that shift happens, The strait is no longer just a passage under threat. It becomes a place where every Iranian-linked hull is potentially a liability, every transit a test, every radio exchange a prelude, and every negotiation in Islamabad haunted by the image of Marines dropping onto a disabled ship in the dark. That is the harder truth inside this story. The seizure of Tusca was not the end of one incident. It was the beginning of a doctrine. And if Tehran misread that, then the red line it crossed was not legal. It was strategic. Because the moment you turn Hormuz from leverage into indiscriminate disorder, you do not force your enemy to step back. You invite him to build a system that hunts